There was a time when Europe had no memory of itself. No written names, no maps, no stories carefully carried across generations. The land existed without explanation, and people moved through it without knowing they would one day be called ancestors. Ice still shaped the ground, forests advanced and retreated, rivers shifted their paths, and human lives bent quietly around these forces. Nothing was recorded, yet everything mattered. This was not an empty world. It was full of breath, motion, and attention. Fires burned low against cave walls, casting shadows that felt alive. Wind crossed open plains, where herds passed and returned, leaving only compressed earth behind them. Footsteps crossed land bridges that no longer exist, paths that ended beneath water thousands of years later. These people did not think of themselves as living before history. They lived inside a present that felt complete. What we now call prehistory was not a void. It was silence. A long silence filled with decisions, adaptations, and moments of understanding that never learned to preserve themselves as stories. Knowledge moved from body to body, from watching to imitation, from repetition to instinct. It did not need explanation to survive. It only needed to work. Modern Europe rests on this silence. Beneath cities, borders, and languages lies a foundation built by hands that never expected recognition. These early lives shaped migration routes, survival strategies, and ways of responding to land that still echo today. Fields are planted where once camps returned, season after season. Roads follow curves, chosen by people who learned where movement was safest. Even habits of gathering, separating, and returning carry traces of these forgotten patterns. Yet history often begins by removing this world entirely. Without writing, it is treated as absence rather than presence. The lack of names becomes proof of insignificance. But influence does not require an audience. The most enduring changes often happen quietly, without witnesses, without ceremony, without any expectation of being remembered. Imagine living without knowing you are leaving something behind. No desire for legacy, no awareness of future eyes looking backward. Every decision was immediate, shaped by weather, hunger, fear, and trust. Survival demanded attention, not reflection. And yet, out of that focus came systems of movement, cooperation, and belonging strong enough to carry forward across thousands of years. This story does not begin with dates or inventions, because those came later. It begins with atmosphere, with cold mornings that bit skin awake, with the comfort of shared warmth in darkness, with listening to land closely enough to know when to stay and when to move. These moments left no sentences behind, only impressions pressed into soil, bone, and memory that never learned how to speak. To understand what follows, something must first be unlearned. The belief that importance requires documentation, that meaning only survives when it is written down. The people who shaped Europe most deeply did so without tools for remembrance. Their influence did not fade because it was weak. It disappeared from view because nothing asked it to explain itself. What remains is not loss, but depth, a thickness of time beneath the surface of the present. As this journey continues, the question will no longer be who these people were. It will be how anything about them can still be known at all. In the quiet gap between what was lived and what was written, clues remain scattered. They wait in patterns rather than sentences, in habits repeated without knowing why. Listening for them requires patience, and a willingness to accept uncertainty without forcing answers. The deeper this story goes, the more listening will replace certainty, and the more silence will begin to feel like instruction rather than emptiness. It prepares us to question not only the past, but the methods we use to define truth, memory, and importance itself over time, before moving deeper into the silence that follows next. History books feel solid. Their pages carry dates, names, and timelines that appear complete, as though the past has already been gathered, sorted, and settled. When something is printed, it gains authority. It feels finished. Yet this sense of completeness is an illusion created by what writing naturally preserves. History books remember what could be recorded, not what mattered most. They do not lie. They simply listen in one narrow direction. Most of what fills textbooks revolves around rulers, wars, borders, and empires. These subjects dominate not because they shaped humanity more deeply, but because they produced documents. Power leaves paperwork. Ordinary lives rarely do, farmers who altered soil over centuries, migrating groups who carved invisible paths across continents, and families who passed knowledge through habit rather than instruction shaped Europe just as profoundly. Their influence spread quietly, without announcements or signatures, and so it faded from written memory. When writing becomes the standard for truth, silence begins to look like absence. Entire populations slip out of the story not because they vanished, but because they never learned to write themselves into it. History, in this sense, is selective by design. It favors permanence over presence. It preserves decisions made by those in control, while dissolving the countless lives that supported them. This is not corruption, it is limitation. There are other forms of memory that do not rely on sentences. Soil remembers repeated planting. Bones remember diet and movement. Rivers remember where people crossed them most often. Archaeology does not recover stories. It recovers patterns. Genetics does not describe beliefs. It reveals encounters, migrations, and interweaving lives. These traces speak slowly, requiring patience rather than interpretation. They suggest continuity where written history sees gaps. Modern identity complicates this further. Nations look backward and search for themselves, projecting borders and labels onto people who never recognized such divisions. Ancient groups did not belong to countries. They belonged to seasons, roots, and relationships. When modern names are placed onto ancient lives, something subtle breaks. The past becomes familiar in the wrong way. Complexity is reduced so it can fit present meaning. This is how confidence replaces curiosity. Once a narrative feels settled, questioning appears unnecessary. Yet the deeper past resists closure. It survives only in fragments that refuse to assemble neatly. History books offer certainty, but certainty often requires compression. What cannot be summarized gets excluded. What cannot be named becomes invisible. Understanding this does not require rejecting history. It requires softening trust in its completeness. Written records are one lens among many, not the final authority. They sit on top of layers they cannot see. Beneath every recorded event lie generations of adaptation, failure, learning, and repetition that made those moments possible. As trust in written memory loosens, attention begins to shift. The question changes from what was written to what shaped behavior before writing existed. If stories came later, then something else came first. To follow that influence, the search must move away from books and toward deeper forces that guided people long before anyone tried to explain themselves. These deeper forces rarely announce themselves clearly. They work through repetition, comfort, fear, and familiarity. A successful movement pattern becomes tradition. A shared response to danger becomes custom. Over time, behavior hardens into expectation, and expectation begins to feel natural. When later historians search for origins, they often mistake structure for intention. What began as adaptation is rewritten as design. The quiet intelligence of survival is replaced with the illusion of planning, and the people who lived it disappear once more behind tidy explanations. Seen this way, history books are not wrong, but incomplete by nature. They are windows with narrow frames, offering clarity while hiding what lies just outside view. As this journey continues, the focus will drift away from recorded events and toward the forces that shaped humanity before memory learned how to speak. To understand early Europe, the listener must learn to read landscapes, habits, and silence itself, because the most influential chapters were never written. They were lived, repeated, and quietly carried forward. The question is no longer what history recorded, but what it overlooked, and why those omissions still shape how the past is understood. There was memory before language, and it lived in the land itself. Long before stories, monuments, or borders, the ground recorded choices through repetition. Ice advanced and withdrew, carving valleys and sealing paths. Forests spread, thinned, then returned again. Rivers shifted their courses slowly, guiding movement without instruction. To live in early Europe was to listen continuously, because survival depended on reading signals written in weather, animals, and seasons. During long glacial cycles, Europe was not a stable place. It opened and closed like a breathing organism. Ice sheets erased familiar routes while exposing new ones. Groups became separated not by intention, but by frozen barriers and rising waters. Innovation was not a goal, it was a response. Clothing thickened, diets shifted, movement patterns adjusted. Every change answered a question the land asked first. Humans did not arrive as conquerors of this environment, they entered as participants. The land offered opportunities, then withdrew them. It rewarded patience and punished rigidity. To move at the wrong time meant death. To settle too long meant scarcity. Over generations, people learned rhythms rather than rules. When animals migrated, humans followed. When forests expanded, tools adapted. When shorelines retreated, memory traveled inland. This relationship left evidence that does not resemble writing, but it persists. Layers of pollen reveal which plants thrived and when. Animal bones show hunting choices and seasonal return. Altered shorelines mark where communities once gathered, now hidden beneath water. These are decisions frozen in matter, preserved without intention. They show where people trusted the land and where the land changed the terms. Many differences later described as culture may have begun here. Groups separated by ice or forest evolved distinct habits simply because their environments demanded different responses. One learned patience with darkness. Another learned speed across open plains. Over time, these adaptations hardened into customs, beliefs, and identity. What later histories would describe as civilizational difference may have started as climate preference and geographic necessity. The land did not care who people thought they were. It responded only to behavior. Success was measured quietly: return, survival, continuation. Failure left no commentary. Entire ways of living disappeared without record, when conditions shifted beyond tolerance. Others endured, not because they were superior, but because they aligned closely with place. Even now, the land remembers more than books do. Modern settlements still cluster where ancient movement once slowed. Roads follow valleys shaped by ice. Borders trace rivers that long guided human crossing. These patterns feel natural because they are inherited, not because they were chosen deliberately. To see early Europe clearly, attention must move away from people for a moment and rest on what surrounded them. Before belief, before story, before memory learned how to speak, there was land shaping response. It formed people gradually, unevenly, and without concern for future meaning. Once this influence is understood, the past begins to fracture into many paths rather than one. Different groups did not diverge because of ideology or conflict, but because they learned different answers to the same environment. The story now moves toward those people themselves, toward how adaptation quietly turned into difference, and how silence allowed multiple Europes to exist at once. This recognition changes the way origins are understood. Instead of searching for founders, attention shifts to conditions. Instead of heroes, patterns emerge. Early Europeans were shaped unevenly, patiently, without awareness of destiny. Their differences were quiet, functional, and uncelebrated. Long before myths explained separation, landscape performed it. Long before borders divided, terrain guided belonging. Understanding this prepares the listener to meet the people themselves, not as characters in a story, but as responses to a place that never stopped teaching. From here, the narrative turns toward those groups, how their adaptations drifted apart, and how human diversity began without argument, intention, or names. It opens the next chapter, where silence gives way to people adapting differently, slowly, quietly, apart again. Europe did not begin as a single people moving outward from a shared beginning. It formed slowly, unevenly, through overlap, rather than unity. Different groups entered the land at different times, drawn by opportunity rather than destination. Some followed animals across open ground, learning to move with herds that never stayed still. Others stayed close to water, reading tides, currents, and shorelines as carefully as tracks in soil. Inland, forests shaped attention toward patience, concealment, and intimate knowledge of place. None of these ways of living was superior. Each simply matched a different answer to the same landscape. These people did not think of themselves as part of something called Europe. Their world rarely extended beyond the distance they could travel and return from. Familiarity ended where the known paths ended. Identity was local, shaped by routine rather than allegiance. A river bend, a seasonal clearing, a stretch of coast mattered more than abstract belonging. What lay beyond was not enemy territory, just unknown ground. Over long spans of time, these paths crossed. Groups met briefly, then separated again. Sometimes they shared tools or techniques. Sometimes they shared nothing except silence. Encounters did not always leave clear traces, but their effects accumulated. A tool shape appeared farther away than expected. A hunting pattern shifted. A way of storing food spread quietly. Exchange did not require agreement or domination. It often happened simply because proximity made imitation possible. Europe was shaped through layering rather than replacement. New arrivals did not always erase those who came before. Often they settled beside them, adapted alongside them, or slowly merged through shared survival. The land did not reset when people arrived. It absorbed them. Over generations, populations blended in ways too gradual to notice. By the time difference became visible, its origin was already forgotten. Later histories tend to search for founders, first peoples, or original cultures. This instinct looks backward and tries to simplify. Yet early Europe resists that kind of clarity. It was never one story unfolding from a single source. It was many stories weaving together, separating, then weaving again. Absence of conflict in the record does not mean harmony. Absence of records means encounters happened without anyone naming them. What survives today is not purity, but mixture. Many people living in Europe now carry ancestry from groups that never described themselves, never left inscriptions, never claimed land in permanent terms. Their presence persists quietly, not as legend, but as inheritance. History struggles to name them, because naming requires boundaries they never recognized. This reframing alters how origin is understood. Instead of a beginning, there was accumulation. Instead of unity, there was proximity. Belonging was practical, not symbolic. Cooperation emerged from necessity, not ideology. Difference developed not because groups intended separation, but because environments taught different lessons. When identity is viewed this way, ancestry becomes less about lineage and more about convergence. Modern categories dissolve under this scale. Borders appear young, labels appear temporary. What remains is movement, meeting, and quiet blending repeated over thousands of years. Europe did not start as one voice learning to speak. It began as many voices sharing space without needing agreement. Their overlap shaped the land as much as the land shaped them. Understanding this prepares the next question. If these groups lived beside and among one another, how did they interact in daily life? How did knowledge pass without records? To answer that, attention must turn toward the moments between encounters, where cooperation, tension, and silent exchange unfolded without witnesses, leaving influence without narrative, and connection without memory. Some of the most important meetings in history ended without anyone knowing they had happened. No ceremony marked them, no witness recorded their details. People crossed paths, shared space for a moment, then continued on, unaware that something had shifted. These encounters did not announce themselves as change. They felt ordinary, almost forgettable. Yet their effects traveled farther than intention ever could. Trade routes formed without maps or agreements. A stone tool from one region appeared hundreds of miles away, carried hand to hand without anyone tracing the journey. Knowledge moved the same way. Fire was tended differently, after watching another group manage it more efficiently. A knot was tied in a new way. A garment layered differently against cold or rain. No one needed permission to learn. Observation was enough. Most exchange did not happen through instruction. There were no teachers standing apart, explaining technique or belief. Learning happened by proximity, by noticing what worked better, by adopting habits that quietly increased survival. Progress emerged not from invention, but from attention. Watching another way of doing something was often safer than trying something entirely new. These meetings rarely felt significant to the people involved. Two groups might share a fire for a night, exchange small items, then move on. A hunting pattern might shift slightly after seeing a different approach. A ritual gesture might be borrowed, not for meaning, but because it felt right in the moment. These changes did not alter life immediately. They settled slowly, becoming familiar through repetition, rather than declaration. Conflict was not required for influence. Neither was harmony. Sometimes groups coexisted briefly. Sometimes they tolerated one another at a distance. Even caution created opportunity for exchange. Watching from afar still taught lessons. Silence still communicated outcomes. The land did not demand unity, only adaptation. Over time, these unrecorded meetings reshaped Europe more deeply than later wars ever could. Wars redraw boundaries quickly, but they rarely change behavior at the root. These quiet encounters altered how people dressed, hunted, gathered, and related. They introduced flexibility where rigidity might have failed. They allowed techniques to spread beyond the limits of family or place. Because nothing was written, these meetings resist reconstruction. History favors moments that declare themselves. It records treaties and battles because they leave marks that can be referenced. But the most enduring exchanges often look like nothing while they are happening. Their significance only appears much later, woven invisibly into daily life. Imagine sitting near a fire shared by strangers, exchanging warmth rather than words. Imagine noticing a tool shaped slightly differently and understanding its advantage without explanation. Imagine carrying that insight back to your own group, adjusting habits without ever naming their source. This is how influence traveled when memory lived inside bodies rather than books. These interactions did not aim to create a shared culture. They simply made survival a little easier. Over generations, ease became habit, and habit became tradition. What began as imitation ended as inheritance. By the time stories tried to explain origins, the true source of many practices was already forgotten. The absence of records does not mean these meetings were rare. It means they were normal. Change did not require drama. It required patience and repetition. Europe was shaped not by moments of conquest alone, but by countless small borrowings that felt too ordinary to preserve. What endured from these encounters did not remain visible as stories. It settled into bodies, instincts, and responses. To understand what survived, attention must move inward, toward traits carried silently across time. The next step is not to ask what people exchanged, but what still lives on inside those exchanges, unseen yet persistent. History did not disappear. It learned how to hide inside us. Long after names faded and stories dissolved, ancient lives continued forward in quieter ways. The bodies of modern Europeans still carry adaptations shaped by environments their ancestors no longer recognize. These traits were not designed with intention. They accumulated through survival, repetition, and chance. Over time, solutions to ancient problems became part of the human frame itself. Some bodies learned to tolerate cold more efficiently. Others adjusted to limited sunlight, changing how nourishment was processed and stored. Certain populations adapted to specific diets, specific climates, specific rhythms of movement and rest. None of this was planned. It emerged slowly, unevenly, and without awareness. These changes did not announce themselves as identity. They functioned simply as advantage or endurance. Genetics preserves probability, not destiny. It does not dictate who someone must become. It offers tendencies shaped by long-forgotten conditions. A resistance once crucial to survival might persist long after the threat disappeared. A sensitivity shaped by scarcity might remain even in abundance. These echoes are not instructions. They are memories waiting to be interpreted by circumstance. Behavior also carries traces of the past. Responses to danger, comfort found in repetition, the impulse to gather or withdraw can all reflect strategies that once worked. These tendencies are not universal. They differ because environments differed. People adapted where they lived, not where they imagined they belonged. Over generations, these adaptations traveled forward, detached from their original meaning. What survives is not a record of events, but a record of responses. Bodies remember what minds no longer know. Muscles, instincts, and internal systems respond faster than thought, guided by patterns older than language. These reactions feel personal, yet many began as shared solutions to shared problems thousands of years ago. This perspective reframes ancestry. It is not a story of origin or purity. It is a layering of influences, each leaving small marks rather than clear signatures. Genetic inheritance does not preserve names or beliefs. It preserves usefulness. Traits that did not help survival faded away quietly. Those that did were carried forward without recognition. Seen this way, the silent ancestors were never erased. They were incorporated. Their influence became intimate rather than visible. Instead of monuments, they left reflexes. Instead of stories, they left tendencies. Their presence does not announce itself as history. It arrives as familiarity, instinct, and unspoken preference. This realization shifts the emotional weight of forgetting. Loss becomes continuity. Absence becomes presence of a different kind. The past did not vanish when writing began. It retreated into forms that did not require memory to function. It learned how to exist without explanation. Understanding genetics as memory rather than identity softens the search for meaning. It removes hierarchy. No adaptation is superior outside the conditions that shaped it. No trait is permanent. The body carries history provisionally, ready to change again when circumstances demand it. The story now begins to widen. From bodies shaped by ancient environments, attention will turn outward again. These inherited tendencies did not remain internal. Over time, they influenced belief, symbol, and ritual. The same responses that guided survival began shaping meaning. As people tried to explain why certain patterns felt natural, early myth and symbolism emerged. From flesh to thought, the past continued forward, quietly preparing the next layer of memory. Before humans told stories, they shaped reality with symbols. There was a moment, long before language settled into structure, when survival alone was no longer enough. Food could be found. Shelter could be kept. Fire could be controlled. And yet, something restless remained. The world still felt unstable, unpredictable, filled with forces that arrived without warning and vanished without explanation. Meaning began as a way to steady that uncertainty. Early Europeans did not have words to describe what they sensed, but they had attention. They noticed patterns. They repeated actions. Gestures returned in familiar ways. Sounds were made again and again, not to explain, but to anchor experience. Marks appeared on bone and stone, not as decoration, but as recognition. Something had been seen, and it needed to be held in place. In caves lit by firelight, shadows stretched and shifted across uneven walls. Shapes moved without touch. Hands pressed against stone, leaving silhouettes in pigment, not to say who was there, but to confirm that someone existed within that moment. Objects were arranged deliberately, not for utility, but for presence. These acts did not emerge from imagination alone. They emerged from a need to make the world feel consistent, even briefly. These were not early attempts at art, belief, or religion. They were responses. When sound echoed in darkness, it felt alive. When fire danced, it appeared intentional. The environment did not yet feel separate from awareness. Meaning formed as a bridge between sensation and understanding long before explanation could follow. Repetition gave comfort. Shared gestures created familiarity. Something unspoken began to bind experience together. Symbolism did not require grammar. It required agreement. When a mark, movement, or sound was repeated and recognized, it became meaningful. Not because it explained reality, but because it stabilized it. In that stability, fear softened. The unknown became less overwhelming. Meaning was not about truth, it was about continuity. This suggests a quiet inversion of what is often assumed. Language did not create meaning. Meaning drew language toward itself. Long before sentences existed, shared perception already had structure. Consciousness grew not from explanation, but from recognition. Seeing the same thing, feeling it together, responding in rhythm. These moments did not ask to be translated into words. They asked only to be repeated. In these early acts, thought crossed a threshold. Awareness turned outward, then back inward. The world was no longer just something to endure. It became something to interpret. Not in symbols meant to last forever, but in moments meant to feel complete. Meaning lived in the act itself, not in its preservation. These shared perceptions created a subtle shift. Once something felt meaningful, it invited return. A place where symbols were made mattered more than other places. A gesture repeated gained weight. Sound used in the same moment carried familiarity. Over time, these patterns began to gather around specific times, locations, and actions. None of this required belief in the modern sense. There were no doctrines, no gods with names, no stories explaining origins. There was only participation. Meaning lived inside behavior, not thought. It emerged from doing the same thing together and sensing that it mattered, even if no one could say why. This is how consciousness learned to rest inside symbols before it learned to speak. Meaning was not something invented, it was discovered, then held carefully through repetition. These early moments did not survive because they were recorded. They survived because they worked. They helped people feel oriented in a world that offered no guarantees. Once meaning exists, it does not remain still. It seeks reinforcement. What feels grounding is returned to. What is returned to becomes ritual. What becomes ritual begins to shape belief. From here, meaning moves away from the moment and towards structure. The next step is inevitable. Shared symbols begin asking to be repeated in specific ways, and repetition becomes expectation. In that quiet shift, early belief systems start to take form, not from revelation, but from habit settling into certainty. The first sacred acts were not about gods, they were about control. When meaning began to gather around certain actions, it did not immediately turn into belief, it turned into repetition. Early Europeans did not worship named beings or imagine distant hierarchies watching from above. Instead, they acted in ways that softened fear and steadied loss. Ritual emerged as practice long before it became explanation. Death was one of the first places where this need became visible. Bodies were not always left where they fell. They were placed carefully, turned toward particular directions, surrounded by objects that once mattered in life. Sometimes pigment was applied, not to decorate, but to mark transition. These choices did not claim to know what came next. They created structure in a moment that could easily dissolve into chaos. Ritual did not deny uncertainty, it acknowledged it. The act itself provided relief, not answers. To place a body, to repeat a gesture, to return to a site again and again, was a way of asserting continuity when something had broken. These actions said nothing about gods or afterlives. They said that loss would not be ignored, that disruption would be held inside pattern rather than allowed to scatter. Offerings followed a similar logic. Food placed somewhere specific, objects set aside, movements repeated at particular times. None of this required explanation to be effective. What mattered was that the act happened, that it could happen again. Ritual stabilized emotion through familiarity. When the future felt unreliable, repetition created something that could be depended on. This reframes ritual as a form of emotional technology. It regulated fear, grief, and uncertainty without needing to define them. It did not solve the world, it made living inside it possible. In this sense, ritual was practical. It reduced psychological chaos in the same way shelter reduced exposure or fire reduced cold. Belief followed later, quietly. Not as revelation, but as accumulation. When an action is repeated often enough, it begins to feel necessary. When it feels necessary, it begins to feel meaningful. Meaning then asks for explanation. But explanation was not the origin. It was the after effect. People did not perform rituals because they believed something specific. They believed because they performed rituals. The act came first. Certainty grew out of familiarity. Over generations, repetition shaped expectation. What was once chosen became assumed. What was assumed became defended. This process did not require agreement. Different groups practiced different rituals shaped by place, loss, and habit. But the function remained consistent. Ritual turned fear into form. It allowed people to approach the unknown without dissolving into it. There was no sudden shift from ritual to religion. There was only layering. As rituals accumulated, stories slowly gathered around them. Not to challenge the practice, but to explain why it felt important. Meaning hardened. Symbols stabilized. Over time, these explanations gained authority, and belief learned to speak aloud. Yet beneath every belief system lies a layer of repetition older than explanation. Even later religions, with doctrines and hierarchies, still rely on the same mechanics. They repeat actions at specific times. They gather people into familiar patterns. They reduce uncertainty by returning again and again to what is known. Seen this way, ritual is not primitive religion. Religion is structured ritual. The difference is not depth, but formalization. What began as flexible response became fixed narrative. but the original purpose remains visible beneath the surface. As rituals repeat across generations, they begin to do more than stabilize emotion. They create belonging. Shared action becomes shared memory. Those who perform the same rituals begin to recognize one another through behavior rather than language. Identity emerges, not from belief alone, but from participation. From here, ritual moves beyond the individual and into the collective. Actions performed together become markers of who belongs and who does not. Memory starts to gather around shared practice. In this shift, identity begins to take form without names, preparing the way for groups to recognize themselves as something held in common, shaped not by belief, but by repetition sustained through time. They knew who they were without ever needing a name for it. Identity existed long before labels were invented to contain it. Early Europeans did not describe themselves as members of tribes, nations, or ethnic groups. They recognized belonging through shared movement, shared work, and shared return. Identity lived in habit rather than declaration, and it shifted as easily as the seasons did. People belonged to those they traveled with, those they gathered beside, those who knew the same paths and pauses. When herds moved, identity moved with them. When seasons changed, belonging adjusted. There was no contradiction in this flexibility. Survival required it. To be rigid in a world that changed constantly was dangerous. Adaptation depended on openness. Shared rituals reinforced this sense of belonging. Participating in the same repeated actions created recognition without explanation. A gesture performed together mattered more than any spoken claim. Identity was something you did, not something you stated. It could be learned. It could be borrowed. It could be left behind when circumstances demanded it. People could move between groups without needing permission. Knowledge traveled with them. Practices blended. Traditions shifted slowly as individuals carried habits from one place to another. Boundaries existed, but they were porous. They were felt through familiarity rather than enforced through exclusion. Difference did not automatically imply threat. It often meant variation. This fluid identity allowed ancient groups to survive instability. When climates shifted or resources declined, movement was possible. Belonging could change without crisis. A group was not defined by ancestry alone, but by present participation. Those who shared daily life shared identity, regardless of origin. The reveal comes quietly here. Rigid identity is recent. The idea that belonging must be fixed, inherited, and defended is not ancient. It emerged later, alongside permanent settlement, controlled memory, and written categories. Early Europe existed before those constraints hardened. Ancient people lived within overlapping circles of belonging. One circle might include those who shared food, another included those who performed the same rituals. Another included those who returned to the same places season after season. These circles expanded and contracted naturally. No single boundary defined the whole self. This way of living resisted simplification. It did not produce clear maps of identity. It did not leave behind names that could be preserved. For historians searching backward, this fluidity appears confusing or incomplete. But to those living it, it was coherent and practical. Identity aligned with function rather than concept. Seeing early identity this way reframes conflict as well. Encounters between groups were not always framed as us versus them. Often they were those we move with now, and those we may move with later. Difference existed without permanent division. Adaptation depended on it. This does not mean ancient life was peaceful or unified. Tension existed, competition existed, but identity was not the primary weapon. Survival was. Boundaries shifted when conditions changed. Alliances formed and dissolved without needing explanation. Understanding this dissolves modern projections onto the past. Ancient Europeans were not early versions of modern categories waiting to be named. They were something else entirely. Their sense of self flowed with movement, place, and participation. Once identity exists, even in this flexible form, it begins to settle. Repeated return to the same places gives weight to location. Shared use of land creates attachment. Memory starts to collect around specific sites. Over time, belonging leans toward place rather than movement. From here, identity begins to anchor itself to landscape. Not suddenly, not deliberately, but through repetition and return. Land becomes more than resource. It becomes reference. This shift prepares the next stage of the story, where memory begins to attach itself to place, and inheritance quietly takes root. Some places were sacred long before anyone asked why. Long before stories tried to explain importance, certain locations simply drew people back. Hills rose above surrounding land and offered wide vision. Caves held darkness, shelter, and echo. Springs emerged reliably from stone, cold and clear even when everything else failed. Open clearings returned again and again as gathering points without instruction. These places mattered first through use, not meaning. Repetition gave them weight. When people returned to the same spot, season after season, memory settled into the ground. Fires were lit where fires had been lit before. Hands touched the same stone surfaces. Voices echoed in the same chambers. Nothing required explanation. Familiarity itself became significance. The land absorbed presence, and presence became association. These locations began to feel different from others. Not because they were named, but because they were known. They carried emotional residue. A cave remembered shelter during storms. A hill remembered safety through visibility. A spring remembered survival during dry months. The place did not speak, but it responded. Returning felt correct, even when the reason could not be articulated. Over generations, these locations became anchors. In a world defined by movement and uncertainty, they offered continuity. Even when groups shifted routes or practices, some places remained constant. They became points of orientation, not only in space, but in experience. They reminded people of what had worked before, meaning accumulated spatially, before it accumulated symbolically. Memory lived in geography. Long before language preserved the past, the land held it through repeated action. This kind of memory did not require storytelling. It existed whether anyone talked about it or not. The quiet twist appears here. Stories likely came later, not earlier. Myths did not make places sacred. Places inspired stories because they already mattered. When explanation became necessary, narrative followed familiarity. People began asking why a place felt important only after importance had already been felt for generations. This reverses a common assumption. Meaning is often imagined as something created by story and belief. But here, belief grew out of use. Land taught importance through experience, and explanation followed afterward. Sacredness was sensed before it was described. This also explains why similar places hold significance across cultures that never met. Caves, water sources, elevated ground appear repeatedly as meaningful locations, not because of shared belief, but because of shared human response. These places met needs reliably. Over time, reliability became reverence. Even now, this pattern persists. People feel drawn to certain landscapes without knowing why. Ruins stand where importance already existed long before stones were arranged. Modern cities rise atop ancient gathering points. Continuity survives without explanation. These places did not demand worship, they offered return. In that return, emotional grounding emerged. Reflection followed repetition. Silence gathered naturally. Over time, these locations became reference points for memory, loss, and continuity. When places gather meaning this way, they begin shaping behavior. Movement adjusts around them, routes bend to pass near them. Time is measured by return. Gradually, temporary stopping becomes habitual. Habit leans toward permanence. From here, land begins influencing settlement. Memory starts attaching to location rather than movement alone. Inheritance follows naturally, not as ownership, but as familiarity passed forward. What mattered before story prepares the ground for what comes next, as sacred places quietly begin shaping where people stay, return, and eventually remain. We still walk where they once learned it was safe. Long before roads were drawn or borders imagined, movement shaped memory. Early Europeans carried knowledge in their feet. They learned where the ground held firm, where rivers could be crossed, where valleys offered shelter from wind and cold. These lessons were not written or explained, they were followed. Seasonal paths formed as people returned to the same routes year after year. Migration was not wandering, it was guided by accumulated experience. A successful crossing became tradition. A dangerous route was quietly abandoned. Over generations, these decisions pressed into the land. Grass flattened, soil compacted, the path remembered, even when individual lives ended. Movement itself became a record. Children learned routes not through instruction, but through repetition. Walking beside elders taught timing, distance, and caution. Knowledge passed silently, reinforced by success rather than story. To stray too far from known paths meant risk. To remain close meant survival. These paths outlived the people who first shaped them. When groups moved, merged, or disappeared, routes often remained. New populations discovered them, not as inventions, but as invitations. A clear passage through forest or mountain suggested prior use. Following it felt sensible, even without knowing why. This quiet persistence explains something familiar. Many modern roads follow ancient paths, not because they are the most efficient by contemporary standards, but because they worked once and continued to work. Humans return to what already knows how to hold them. Infrastructure grows outward from habit more often than from planning. Movement shaped settlement as well. Temporary stopping points gained importance because paths converged there. A river crossing, a sheltered bend, a wide clearing, where routes met naturally invited rest. Over time, rest became return. Return became expectation. Expectation leaned toward permanence. Paths also carried culture. Techniques, gestures, and habits traveled along them unnoticed. A tool shape spread because a route allowed repeated contact. A ritual gesture moved with people who walked the same ground. Exchange followed movement, not design. These routes did not belong to anyone. They were shared, adjusted, and respected through use. Ownership did not define them. Familiarity did. The land did not enforce boundaries, but it encouraged continuity. Even conflict respected these paths. Movement during tension still followed what was known. Risk was managed by staying within familiar corridors. The land's memory offered predictability in unstable moments. Seen from above, Europe became a network of inherited motion. A living map drawn by repetition rather than intention. When later settlements hardened into villages and towns, they often sat where paths already converged. What felt like strategic choice was often recognition of something older. This continuity explains why the present feels layered. Walking through modern cities, people unknowingly follow ancient decisions. Beneath pavement lies compressed earth, once shaped by passing feet. Beneath highways lie routes chosen for safety, long before engines existed. As paths stabilize, movement slows. Familiar stops become dependable. Dependable places invite staying. What began as motion prepares the ground for settlement. From here, temporary shelter becomes lasting presence, and the story moves toward what happens when stopping turns into remaining, and paths begin to anchor people to place. It is in this gradual slowing that memory starts to cling. Return creates attachment, and attachment invites care. The more often a place is reached by familiar paths, the harder it becomes to leave without consequence. What was once simply useful begins to feel necessary. Over time, the land no longer just guides movement. It begins to expect it. In that expectation, human behavior changes. Staying feels safer than leaving. Familiar ground feels trustworthy compared to uncertainty beyond it. This quiet shift does not announce itself, but it transforms everything. Paths that once connected movement now begin to organize life around them. They tell people where to go, when to return, and eventually where to remain. With that change, the story prepares to move from motion into memory, anchored in place, where land no longer just remembers footsteps, but begins to hold generations. This moment leads directly towards settlement, inheritance, and permanence, where paths stop being choices and slowly become obligations passed forward through time, carried by habit rather than decision, generation after generation. The moment humans stayed still, time began to close in around them. For most of their existence, movement had been the answer to uncertainty. When resources faded, people left. When seasons changed, routes adjusted. The world remained wide and responsive. Staying, by contrast, required a different kind of trust. It meant believing that a place would continue to provide, not just once, but again and again. This shift did not arrive suddenly. There was no single decision to settle, no clear break between movement and permanence. Instead, staying crept in quietly. A place that offered safety, 1 year was returned to the next. A familiar clearing became a regular stopping point. Over time, return replaced departure. What had once been temporary began to feel dependable. Staying was not progress. It was risk. Movement allowed escape from failure. Settlement required endurance through it. To remain meant trusting seasons you could not control, land that might change its behavior, and cycles that could turn hostile without warning. Staying narrowed options, even as it promised stability. This decision reshaped how people understood time. Movement oriented life around cycles of return. Settlement introduced waiting. Seasons became schedules. The future felt closer and more demanding. Responsibility expanded. Stored food had to be protected. Land had to be watched. Loss could no longer be escaped by leaving. It had to be endured where it occurred. Belief shifted with this change. Rituals tied to movement adapted to fixed locations. Sacred places became central rather than occasional. Memory gathered more densely. The past began to feel present, because it occupied the same space repeatedly. Staying allowed accumulation, not just of objects, but of meaning. With accumulation came clarity. Patterns were easier to see. Lineage became traceable. Ownership emerged gradually, not as concept, but as familiarity turned into claim. Responsibility hardened. Roles stabilized. The world felt more predictable, but also more confined. This predictability made history possible. Events could now be placed in relation to one another. Memory could attach itself to fixed points. The past no longer drifted. It stacked. Time felt thicker, more detailed. Life accelerated in complexity because consequences accumulated rather than dispersing. Yet, something else began to thin. Mystery retreated. Movement once placed people inside uncertainty regularly. Staying reduced exposure to the unknown. The world became smaller, more manageable, but also less expansive. What could not be controlled was pushed outward, away from daily life. Fixing oneself to a place sharpened memory, but narrowed imagination. The unknown felt less familiar. The horizon closed in. The land that once guided movement now demanded attention. Adaptation gave way to management. Control replaced listening. This trade was never announced. No one declared that mystery would fade. It simply became less necessary. Survival depended less on sensing change and more on maintaining balance. Over generations, this balance hardened into expectation. The world felt explainable enough. From this point forward, life would organize itself differently. Staying required rules. Rules invited roles. Roles produced hierarchy. Hierarchy concentrated influence. What began as trust in a place became trust in certain people. With that shift, power began to emerge quietly. The idea of staying changed everything that followed. It made memory heavier, time faster, and life more structured. It set the stage for societies that would soon define themselves through control rather than movement. As settlement took hold, the forces shaping humanity turned inward. Structure replaced silence. Order replaced adaptation. The next chapter begins where this change becomes unavoidable, where permanence gives rise to hierarchy, and where the foundations of organized power quietly come into view. Staying still changed the shape of attention. Movement had once absorbed uncertainty by making it temporary. When resources thinned, people left. When conditions worsened, routes adjusted. Settlement reversed this logic. Remaining in one place asked people to face change directly, without escape. Reliability replaced flexibility, and with it came a new weight. At first, staying felt reassuring. Familiar land produced predictable returns. Storage allowed food to outlast seasons. Shelter improved. Yet each solution introduced obligation. Stored grain demanded protection. Cleared land required maintenance. The future could no longer be avoided. It had to be managed. Time shifted from something observed to something scheduled. Staying still required vigilance. Eyes that once scanned horizons for opportunity now watched boundaries for disruption. People paid closer attention to one another because proximity made behavior consequential. Small actions accumulated meaning. Noise carried. Absence was noticed. Responsibility thickened around presence. Surplus altered perception as well. When resources could be counted, they could be worried over. Loss became measurable. Security produced anxiety about its removal. Instead of adapting to scarcity by moving on, people learned to guard abundance. This subtle shift changed how threat was understood. Danger no longer approached only from environment, it could emerge from within. Conflict did not arise because ambition suddenly appeared. It emerged because people were closer, longer. Disagreements that once dissolved with separation now lingered. Boundaries that once flexed became defended. The first permanent homes also built the first permanent problems, not through intent, but through proximity. Tolerance narrowed quietly. Disruption that might once have been absorbed by movement now felt personal. Change carried consequence. Stability rewarded consistency and punished deviation. Over time, behavior hardened. Expectations formed. Adaptation slowed because it risked upsetting balance that had become precious. This did not feel like failure at the time. Early settlement was an experiment without hypothesis. People tested staying because it seemed to work, not because they understood the cost. When hardship arrived, it was endured rather than escaped. Endurance became a value. Patience became necessary. Control began to feel preferable to uncertainty. Psychology shifted alongside environment. The mind that once tracked possibility now tracked maintenance. Attention focused inward. Memory grew detailed because the same place produced repeated reference. The past felt closer because it occupied the same ground. But the future also felt heavier, because leaving no longer dissolved consequence. Staying produced deeper survival, but less freedom. It made life safer in one way and tighter in another. This trade was not chosen knowingly. It emerged gradually through repetition. Each year of staying made the next year harder to abandon. Attachment deepened, and with it, responsibility. Over generations, this new stability shaped emotion. Trust became localized, belonging narrowed. Cooperation grew necessary, but also conditional. When everyone depended on the same space, influence mattered more. Some voices carried further, some actions weighed heavier. Patterns of influence began to appear without announcement. Seen this way, early settlements were not progress stories. They were adaptations with consequences that only became visible much later. Staying still solved one problem by creating others. Survival improved, but tolerance shrank. Complexity increased, but imagination thinned. Once people remained long enough, differences in behavior and contribution became noticeable. Attention followed usefulness. Dependence created expectation. Expectation quietly granted influence. From here, structure would begin forming naturally, not because power was sought, but because stability demanded coordination. The ground was now set for hierarchy to emerge, slowly and almost unnoticed, carried forward by the simple decision to stay. This change also altered how people judged one another. Contribution became visible because tasks were repeated in the same place. Reliability gained value. Those who stored well, planned carefully, or remembered cycles were noticed more often. Dependence slowly translated into trust, and trust into expectation. Nothing formal marked this shift. No titles appeared. Influence gathered through usefulness and familiarity, not command. Over time, listening followed contribution, and contribution shaped direction. The social ground subtly tilted, preparing minds to accept guidance without questioning its origin. Stability invited leadership, even before leadership was named. In this quiet adjustment, equality loosened without anyone resisting. Differences felt practical, not moral. Yet once accepted, they persisted. The experiment of settlement continued, unaware that its smallest compromises would echo forward for generations, shaping societies long after movement was no longer remembered as an option. That consequence would soon become impossible to ignore, as permanence demanded organization and reshaped human relationships. The first leaders were followed long before they were obeyed. Power did not arrive dressed in command or enforced by threat. It appeared quietly, through reliance. In early settlements, some people noticed things others overlooked. They remembered when frost came early, when water levels shifted, when certain patterns repeated. They did not announce this knowledge. Others simply began to listen. Influence formed through usefulness. Someone who predicted seasons accurately saved effort and loss. Someone who remembered which rituals steadied fear became central during moments of uncertainty. Someone who mediated disputes helped stability return faster. None of this required authority. It required trust. And trust, once extended repeatedly, changed the balance of attention. Reliance turned into expectation. When guidance worked once, people returned to it again. When it worked consistently, ignoring it felt risky. Over time, this pattern hardened. Listening became habit. Habit became deference. Yet nothing about this process felt like surrender. It felt practical. Early authority was fragile and constantly renegotiated. It did not exist as position, only as moment. A person might be trusted during planting seasons and ignored during conflict. Another might hold influence during rituals but not during daily work. Leadership shifted with circumstance because survival demanded flexibility. There were no rulers in the modern sense, no permanent command, no titles to secure status. There were only individuals whose voices carried weight because experience suggested they should. Influence moved fluidly, responding to need rather than ambition. The quiet twist lies here. Power did not emerge because people wanted to rule. It emerged because others needed consistency. When environments became predictable, reliability mattered. When people stayed in one place, remembering cycles became essential. Trust naturally concentrated around those who provided it. Control was granted before it was taken. Influence was offered before it was claimed. This distinction matters. Authority grew not through force, but through acceptance. Once people adjusted behavior based on guidance, direction followed effortlessly. This process also reshaped responsibility. Those listened to felt pressure to remain accurate. Their memory mattered more. Their mistakes carried consequence. Influence became burden as much as advantage. Maintaining trust required consistency. Over time, expectation hardened further. When guidance repeated successfully, deviation began to feel dangerous. Others deferred not because they were compelled, but because uncertainty felt worse. This emotional logic stabilized influence. Influence also became visible. Patterns emerged. The same people were consulted repeatedly. Attention gathered. Others noticed. The social landscape subtly rearranged itself around reliability. What began as situational guidance leaned toward permanence. This transition did not produce immediate inequality. It produced differentiation. Roles emerged organically. Some people organized, some remembered, some mediated. These roles were not inherited yet. They were earned repeatedly through usefulness. But repetition laid groundwork for continuity. As influence stabilized, it began to seek reinforcement. Memory needed preservation. Guidance needed validation. Rituals aligned around certain voices. Symbols emerged to anchor trust. What was once momentary began reaching toward permanence. In this stage, power still felt personal. It depended on relationship and recognition. But the conditions for authority were forming. Repetition made influence familiar. Familiarity made it expected. Expectation leaned toward structure. Once influence became predictable, the idea of continuity followed naturally. People began assuming guidance would come from the same sources. Children observed who spoke and who was listened to. Patterns quietly prepared themselves to be inherited. This shift marked the edge between fluid cooperation and emerging hierarchy. No laws were written, no commands declared, but attention itself had chosen favorites. The social balance tilted, not dramatically, but enough to matter. From here, influence would begin anchoring itself in memory and symbol. What worked repeatedly would seek permanence. Roles would outlast individuals. Authority would solidify, not through force, but through familiarity passed forward. This is where power begins to resemble structure, not yet rigid, not yet named, but increasingly expected. Once consistency matters more than adaptability, influence stops wandering and begins to settle. And when influence settles, it invites inheritance. The future began choosing people before they could choose themselves. What started as flexible responses to immediate need slowly hardened into expectations that outlived the moment. In early settlements, certain roles had proven useful. Someone remembered cycles accurately. Another preserved rituals that kept uncertainty at bay. Someone else organized labor when coordination mattered. At first, these roles shifted easily. They belonged to circumstance, not to people. Over time, repetition changed their nature. When the same kind of guidance worked again and again, it felt safer to return to it. What had been situational became reliable. Reliability became preferred. Preference turned into habit. No one announced this change. It simply settled into daily life. As settlement deepened, flexibility began to feel risky. Stability depended on continuity. Knowing who handled which responsibility reduced uncertainty. Children grew up watching the same people perform the same functions. Familiarity shaped expectation long before instruction did. Without being told, young minds absorbed patterns of contribution and influence. Necessity became tradition quietly. Knowledge keepers were relied upon so often that their role began to feel permanent. Ritual specialists repeated actions that steadied emotion, and repetition granted authority. Organizers coordinated work because coordination worked. None of this required justification. It simply reduced friction. The subtlety of this shift made it difficult to notice. No one decided that roles should be inherited. They were simply easier to maintain than to question. When something functioned well, altering it felt unnecessary. Repeating what worked felt safer than re-evaluating it. Children did not step into roles because they were chosen. They stepped into them because the space was already shaped. Expectation formed before preference. Skills were guided, sometimes unconsciously, toward what was needed. Identity leaned toward function. This is where inequality quietly began, not as injustice, but as convenience. Differences were practical, not moral. Some roles carried more influence because they touched more people. Others carried less because their impact was quieter. These differences were accepted because they simplified coordination. Flexibility faded slowly. As roles stabilized, movement between them became rarer. Learning everything was no longer necessary when specific people were expected to handle specific tasks. Specialization deepened. Dependence increased. Structure emerged, not through decree, but through habit. Once roles stayed long enough, memory adjusted. Stories formed around continuity rather than change. The past began to favor what remained consistent. Innovation felt disruptive when stability was valued. Tradition gained weight because it reduced risk. This transition reshaped how people understood fairness. Equality had once been expressed through shared movement and shared exposure to uncertainty. Now it was expressed through contribution to stability. Difference was justified by usefulness. Questioning roles felt like questioning survival itself. Nothing about this shift felt dramatic. It unfolded across generations. Each small compromise appeared harmless. Each repetition seemed logical. Yet together, they produced a society less flexible than before. From this point on, behavior would increasingly follow expectation rather than circumstance. Memory would start selecting what reinforced structure. Roles would outlive the individuals who filled them. And once memory began favoring permanence over adaptability, the story of the past would change with it. What people remembered mattered now. What they forgot mattered more. When memory mattered, forgetting became a threat. As people stayed in place longer and roles solidified, shared knowledge stopped drifting freely. What had once lived loosely in habit and repetition now needed consistency. Seasons had to be predicted reliably. Rituals had to be performed at the right moment. Agreements had to be remembered the same way by everyone. Memory shifted from something organic into something that required care. This was not about preserving truth. It was about preserving order. Stability depended on sameness, and sameness depended on recall. When memory aligned, behavior followed predictably. When memory fractured, confusion followed. Slowly, remembering stopped being passive. It became work. Certain people were trusted to hold this responsibility. They remembered cycles, agreements, and proper sequence. Their role was not to interpret the past, but to keep it intact. Over time, this trust granted quiet authority. What they recalled shaped what others expected. What they repeated gained weight. What they failed to mention faded without argument. Forgetting became dangerous not because it erased truth, but because it disrupted continuity. If the timing of a ritual was forgotten, anxiety returned. If the memory of an agreement blurred, conflict followed. The past began to influence the present more directly because stability depended on its accuracy. Memory, once communal and flexible, tightened. It became selective without announcing itself. Not everything could be remembered equally. Some experiences did not support order. Some variations introduced uncertainty. Those memories drifted towards silence. Others were repeated because they worked. Over time, repetition transformed usefulness into importance. This marked a subtle turning point. Memory no longer served experience alone. It served structure. What was remembered shaped how people behaved. What faded quietly lost relevance. Not because it was false, but because it was no longer necessary. History began its slow transformation here. Lived experience gave way to curated narrative. Not a formal story yet, but a pattern of emphasis. Events that reinforced stability were recalled more clearly. Those that challenged it softened, then disappeared. This process required no intent. It happened through preference and relief. Those entrusted with memory did not necessarily seek power. They inherited responsibility that others no longer wanted to carry. Remembering accurately became labor. Forgetting became negligence. Over time, authority attached itself to recall, because recall reduced risk. This altered how the past was experienced. It no longer felt distant. It hovered over the present, informing choices and limiting options. People began acting in anticipation of memory. The question shifted from what feels right now to what has worked before. Once memory is externalized, it can be shared. Once it is shared, it can be coordinated. Once it is coordinated, it can be managed. The past stopped being personal. It became communal property, guarded for stability rather than curiosity. This did not erase creativity, but it narrowed acceptable variation. When order mattered, novelty felt threatening. The safest future appeared to be one that resembled the remembered past. Innovation slowed where memory grew heavy. The quiet reveal emerges here. The first control over history did not begin with writing or rulers. It began with responsibility. When some people were trusted to remember, others were free to stop remembering. Dependence followed. From this point forward, memory would no longer drift. It would be protected, organized, and eventually shaped. Once guarded, it became adjustable. Once adjustable, it invited influence. The story now moves toward what happens when memory stops being shared experience and becomes something that can be arranged, emphasized, and altered, gently at first, then deliberately. Some truths survived because they were useful, not because they were true. As memory became guarded, not everything could remain equally alive. Experience was abundant, but attention was limited. Societies began to repeat what helped them hold together and quietly release what did not. This process was not violent or deliberate. It unfolded through relief. The stories that reduced uncertainty were the ones people returned to. When a memory supported stability, it was shared more often. When it reinforced cooperation, it felt safe to remember. When it encouraged obedience to cycles, roles, or expectations, it carried comfort. Other memories drifted away, not because they were dangerous, but because they offered no guidance. They explained nothing that needed explaining. Over time, usefulness became a filter. Storytelling emerged as a stabilizing force. Stories organized experience into patterns that could be remembered and repeated. They smoothed contradiction. They removed excess detail. What remained was not always accurate, but it was coherent. Coherence mattered more than completeness. This narrowing did not feel like loss. It felt like clarity. Repetition transformed certain narratives into anchors. The past began to feel understandable because it was simplified. Stories no longer reflected everything that happened. They reflected what needed to be believed in order to continue. Early storytelling did not aim to deceive. It aimed to orient. It helped people anticipate behavior, justify decisions, and explain why things should remain as they were. In doing so, it gradually replaced lived complexity with narrative stability. Memory shifted from experience into explanation. Over generations, repetition hardened these explanations. What was useful once became necessary later. What was necessary felt unquestionable. The difference between memory and truth softened. A story told often enough began to feel permanent. Its origin mattered less than its effect. This is how realities disappear quietly, not through erasure, but through irrelevance. Experiences that did not fit the preferred pattern simply stopped being told. Without repetition, they thinned. Without thinning, they vanished. The past adjusted itself to meet present needs. This process shaped emotion as well. People felt safer inside familiar stories. Doubt receded where explanation existed. Complexity felt heavy when simplicity offered rest. Over time, belief formed not from conviction, but from relief. As stories narrowed, they became shared reference points. Those who knew them belonged. Those who did not felt distant. Identity began forming around common narrative rather than shared experience. Memory started defining who was inside and who was outside. This was the beginning of selective continuity. Societies carried forward versions of the past that justified their present shape. Change slowed where memory favored consistency. Difference felt disruptive when it contradicted story. Nothing about this required force. Repetition did the work. The same stories told around fires, in ritual moments, and during transition gained gravity. Other versions slipped out of reach. Silence returned, but now it was directed. The past did not vanish, it was filtered. What remained was not false, but partial. A past shaped by need rather than curiosity. By the time writing appeared, much had already been decided about what mattered. As stories narrowed, identity crystallized further. Belonging depended increasingly on shared narrative. The next stage follows naturally, as these chosen stories begin shaping who people believe themselves to be, fixing boundaries that had once remained fluid, and preparing memory to serve not just order, but definition itself. The moment people agreed on a past, they began disagreeing on who belonged. Once stories stabilized and memory narrowed, identity followed. Belonging was no longer defined only by shared movement or participation. It became defined by recognition. Those who knew the same stories felt familiar. Those who did not felt distant, even if they lived nearby. This division did not begin with hatred. It began with uncertainty. When shared memory shaped behavior, unfamiliar memory disrupted it. Someone who remembered differently introduced unpredictability. Difference did not feel wrong, but it felt risky. Over time, distance formed not because of conflict, but because of discomfort. Stories acted as boundaries. Knowing them meant understanding how to behave, when to act, what mattered. Forgetting or challenging them unsettled order. Slowly, identity shifted from fluid participation into fixed narrative. Us became those who remembered correctly. Them became those who did not. At first, this distinction remained soft. Groups coexisted with variation. Differences were noted, not condemned. But as memory hardened, variation felt heavier. Familiarity narrowed. Empathy required effort, where once it had come naturally through shared experience. The more identity settled, the less room it left for difference. Distance grew quietly. When groups stopped sharing stories, they stopped sharing understanding. Without understanding, interpretation filled the gap. Motives were assumed. Intentions were guessed. Suspicion followed absence of familiarity, not evidence of threat. Over generations, these assumptions solidified. Stories repeated inside one group sounded strange or wrong outside it. What felt natural to one felt foreign to another. Boundaries that once shifted easily began to resist movement. Belonging was no longer something you stepped into. It became something you inherited. This change reshaped empathy. Early Europe had relied on adaptability. Identity shifted with context. That flexibility allowed encounter without immediate division. Now, as identity fixed itself to memory, empathy narrowed. Understanding required translation rather than participation. Silence did not disappear. It was reassigned. What did not fit the shared story was no longer spoken. Not because it was forbidden, but because it felt irrelevant. Silence became a marker of exclusion rather than openness. The quiet power of this shift lies in its invisibility. No one declared division necessary. It emerged from familiarity, choosing itself repeatedly. Memory offered comfort. Comfort demanded consistency. Consistency excluded variation. Once identity hardened, it defended itself automatically. Stories protected boundaries. Boundaries justified separation. Separation felt natural because it reduced uncertainty. Empathy weakened not through cruelty, but through habit. This process did not erase ancient fluidity overnight, but it pushed it further into the background. Silence still existed, but it no longer guided belonging. It became something outside identity, rather than part of it. By the end of this shift, Europe was no longer a landscape of overlapping circles alone. It was becoming a collection of defined groups, each anchored by shared memory. Movement slowed, boundaries held. Difference mattered more than circumstance. This moment marked an irreversible turn. Once identity fixes itself to story, it resists change. Memory becomes defense, belonging becomes conditional. Silence remains, but it is no longer shared. It waits beneath the surface, disconnected from the structures above it. With memory controlled and identity fixed, the conditions are set for a final transformation. What has been guarded, filtered, and defined now seeks permanence beyond living recall. The next step is inevitable. Power will learn how to write, and once it does, silence will be layered over in ink rather than habit. Writing did not preserve the past. It selected it. When marks first appeared, they were not born from a desire to remember lives as they were lived. They emerged from a need to manage. Resources had to be counted. Obligations had to be tracked. Boundaries had to be clarified. Authority needed structure. The earliest writing was not memory shaped into story. It was control shaped into symbol. Tallies marked quantities. Lines marked land. Lists marked ownership. These early records did not ask who people were or how they understood the world. They asked what could be measured, claimed, or enforced. Writing entered human life as an administrative tool long before it became a narrative one. It answered practical questions, not existential ones. This distinction matters because it reshaped what the past could be. Fluid traditions, shared rituals, and unspoken understandings did not fit easily into fixed symbols. They lived through repetition and presence, not transcription. When writing became the standard for legitimacy, anything that could not be captured in marks began to lose authority. Silence did not disappear. It was simply excluded. The complexity of prehistoric life was too wide for compression. Shared knowledge often existed without clear boundaries. Rituals adapted to moment and place. Agreements shifted with circumstance. Writing demanded precision, where life had relied on flexibility. In translating experience into symbol, something was always left behind. Once something was written, it gained permanence. It could be pointed to, repeated, and enforced. It felt solid. But permanence came at a cost. What was not written lost standing. Oral memory became secondary. Habit became unreliable. Experience without record became questionable. The past narrowed, not because it was reduced, but because recognition became conditional. This did not feel like erasure at the time. Writing brought clarity. It reduced confusion. It stabilized relationships where memory had drifted. It allowed coordination across distance and time. These advantages were real, but they also redirected attention. Truth began to mean what could be verified. Meaning began to mean what could be recorded. Over time, people stopped trusting what could not be pointed to. The past that lived in bodies, movement, and place felt less legitimate than the past held in symbols. Memory shifted outward. Authority followed it. Writing did not replace silence. It overshadowed it. The unsettling realization arrives quietly. Writing does not remember more. It remembers differently. It chooses what can be fixed and ignores what cannot. In doing so, it reshapes reality itself. What survives feels complete only because alternatives fade from view. This process favored those whose lives aligned with record-keeping. Landholders appeared more real than travelers. Contracts mattered more than custom. Boundaries replaced paths. The world grew sharper and smaller at the same time. Silence deepened not through disappearance, but through disqualification. Knowledge that could not be written was no longer recognized as knowledge. The past that once guided behavior through familiarity now required documentation to matter. Writing did not invent history. It curated it. It filtered lived experience through need and authority. What emerged felt definitive because it could be repeated exactly. But repetition is not the same as truth. It is consistency enforced. Once writing exists, control over it becomes power over meaning. Those who write decide what endures. Those who read decide what matters. And everything else, no matter how deeply it once shaped life, recedes into the background, carrying influence without acknowledgement, waiting beneath the written surface to be noticed again. The past began to belong to those who could read it. When writing entered daily life, not everyone entered with it. Literacy was rare, learned slowly, and often guarded carefully. Symbols were difficult to master, and that difficulty itself created distance. Those who could read marks held something others did not strength, not weapons, but access. This access changed how authority worked. Written symbols allowed agreements to exist beyond memory. Obligations could be enforced without witnesses. Ownership could be declared without presence. The written word did not need to persuade. It only needed to be recognized. Once recognized, it carried weight independent of the person who wrote it. Those who learned to read became interpreters between symbol and life. They did not simply transmit information. They shaped meaning by deciding what symbols referred to and how they applied. This power was quiet. It required no physical dominance. It relied on trust in the permanence of marks rather than the fallibility of memory. Writing felt stable because it did not change. Spoken memory shifted with circumstance and emotion. Written marks appeared fixed. This appearance of permanence created belief. People trusted writing not because it was accurate, but because it endured unchanged. A mark made years earlier still looked the same. Experience, by contrast, faded and conflicted. Memory moved outside the body. Knowledge no longer depended solely on repetition or recall. It could be stored, referenced, and enforced. This relieved individuals of the burden of remembering everything. But it also transferred control. What mattered most was no longer what people remembered together, but what had been preserved correctly. Over time, people learned to doubt their own recollection when it disagreed with written record. Experience became secondary to documentation. If memory conflicted with symbol, symbol prevailed. The past hardened into form, even when lived reality suggested complexity. Those who could read controlled access to this external memory. They explained what marks meant, when they applied, and how they should be followed. Their authority rested not on insight alone, but on mediation. Without them, writing was silent. With them, it spoke definitively. This distinction pushed the silent ancestors further into shadow. Their knowledge did not vanish, but it no longer carried equal legitimacy. Ways of knowing that relied on habit, movement, and place could not be easily translated into marks. What could not be written slowly lost voice. The division between those who read and those who did not reshaped belonging. Literacy created a new boundary that did not align with age, strength, or contribution. It aligned with access. Those inside the circle of writing defined agreements. Those outside adapted. This shift felt practical, not oppressive. Writing made coordination easier. It reduced dispute. It clarified expectation. Its authority felt neutral because it was impersonal. Yet neutrality hid power. Symbols did not argue. They simply existed, and existence implied correctness. As writing spread, belief adjusted. Trust shifted away from shared memory toward preserved record. Truth felt safer when it could be pointed to. Experience lost standing when it could not be verified. The written past began to feel more real than the lived one. Generations born into written systems accepted this without resistance. Symbols had always been there. Documents had always mattered. What preceded them felt distant and vague. Silence became associated with absence rather than depth. Knowledge that could not be cited felt incomplete. This created a subtle distance between people and their own memory. Lived experience began to feel provisional, something that could be challenged by reference. Personal certainty weakened when confronted with record. The written past stood firm, while experience remained fluid. In moments of disagreement, symbols decided outcomes. This reinforced trust in writing not because it felt right, but because it ended uncertainty. The keepers of writing became guardians of continuity. They ensured sequences remained intact, meanings stable, and references consistent. Their role appeared service-oriented, yet it shaped collective reality. By determining what could be cited, they determined what could be defended. The boundary between remembering and ruling grew thin, without ever being acknowledged. This shift quietly prepared the ground for belief systems shaped by record, rather than experience alone. Once authority controlled writing, belief followed naturally. Symbols did not just record reality. They began shaping it. What was written guided action. What was unwritten faded. The past belonged increasingly to those who could read it, and the future followed accordingly. Permanence replaced presence as guide. The old belief survived by pretending to be something else. As writing gained authority, the past began to reorganize itself. Oral traditions that had once lived through movement, repetition, and adaptation were not destroyed. They were reshaped. Stories that had been flexible, local, and responsive to context were gathered, ordered, and fixed. What emerged were myths, not as inventions, but as translations. In their earliest forms, these stories had no single version. They changed slightly with each telling, adjusting to place, audience, and moment. Meaning lived in variation. Writing altered this. Once stories were recorded, difference felt like error. Consistency became valued over responsiveness. A story written once could now be repeated exactly, and exactness began to feel like authority. Gods gained names where forces had once been felt. Lineages formed where relationships had once overlapped. Hierarchies appeared where influence had once shifted fluidly. This was not deception. It was simplification. Complex pasts were difficult to manage. Overlapping beliefs did not translate well into systems of governance. Clean origin stories were easier to teach, easier to defend, easier to enforce. Myth-making did not invent belief. It reorganized it. Ancient understandings of land, cycle, and relationship were condensed into figures and narratives that could stand still on a page. What had once been sensed became personified. What had once been repeated became commanded. This made memory portable, but less intimate. Prehistoric wisdom did not vanish. It survived inside these myths, disguised. Old rhythms became divine laws. Seasonal returns became sacred calendars. Natural forces became personalities with motives. The content remained, but the relationship changed. Instead of participation, belief asked for acceptance. Instead of repetition, it asked for agreement. This process allowed power to align itself with meaning. If God spoke through written myth, those who interpreted myth gained authority. Memory no longer belonged to those who lived it, but to those who explained it. What could be cited mattered more than what was felt. Something subtle was lost here. Not knowledge, but closeness to it. When meaning lived in ritual and habit, it was reinforced through action. When meaning lived in story, it moved into thought. The distance between experience and understanding widened. Myths also introduced beginnings and endings. The past became something that started at a definable moment. Everything before that moment blurred into irrelevance. Prehistory was no longer depth, it was preface. The layered complexity of early life was compressed into a few sanctioned narratives. This created the illusion of clarity. A single story could be taught repeatedly, variance could be dismissed, doubt could be reduced, but clarity came with narrowing. What did not fit the chosen narrative fell away, quietly, without resistance. Communities began to recognize themselves through these myths. Shared story replaced shared movement. Identity tied itself to origin tales rather than participation. The past became something to inherit, rather than something to feel. This shift prepared the way for history to define itself. Once myths were fixed, a starting point could be declared. Writing could draw a line and say, "This is where memory begins." Everything earlier became expendable. Background, silence. The old beliefs did not fail. They were absorbed. They continued shaping behavior beneath the surface of new names and forms. But their intimacy faded. The bond between land, body, and meaning loosened as explanation replaced familiarity. By the end of this transformation, something essential had changed. Humanity still remembered, but it no longer remembered together. Memory had moved from shared experience into structured narrative. Silence remained, but it no longer guided belief. It waited outside the written story, holding what could not be simplified. With myth fixed in writing, the conditions were set. History could now declare its beginning confidently, unaware of how much had already been filtered away. The next step would be decisive. Once the past was written, it could be ranked. Once it could be ranked, everything that came before writing could be treated as lesser, incomplete, or unnecessary. This is where prehistory would be officially left behind, not because it ended, but because it no longer fit the story that writing was ready to tell. Prehistory did not end. It was dismissed. When writing became the measure of what counted, a line was drawn across time, clean and confident. On one side stood history, visible, documented, explainable. On the other side lay everything that came before, labeled incomplete, unclear, or primitive. This division was never about importance. It was about convenience. Writing offered a beginning point that could be pointed to. It gave the past an edge, a place where stories could be numbered and ordered. Everything before that edge resisted neat arrangement. It did not fit timelines easily. It did not announce itself in dates or declarations. So it was set aside, not with hostility, but with indifference. This shift felt reasonable. History, as defined by writing, appeared richer because it could be cited. It offered names, sequences, and causes. Prehistory, by comparison, appeared silent. That silence was mistaken for absence. What could not speak in the new language was assumed to have less to say. Yet nothing truly ended at that boundary. Lives continued seamlessly across it. Habits persisted. Beliefs flowed forward unchanged in form, if not in explanation. The line did not separate worlds. It separated methods of remembering. But once drawn, it reshaped perception. Civilizations began looking forward rather than downward. Progress replaced continuity as the primary lens. The value of the past was measured by how far away it was, not how deeply it shaped the present. Older became lesser, earlier became simpler. The idea of advancement required something to advance from. This reframing quietly altered respect. The silent ancestors were no longer contributors to an ongoing story. They became background conditions. Necessary, perhaps, but finished. Their influence was acknowledged only in passing, as groundwork already cleared. The injustice of this is subtle. No one declared ancient lives meaningless. They were simply excluded from relevance. Once history had a starting point, everything before it became preamble. Useful only insofar as it explained what came later. This dismissal shaped imagination. Curiosity narrowed. Instead of asking how long a pattern had existed, people asked when it began. Instead of sensing continuity, they sought origin moments. Deep memory lost value because it resisted clarity. The idea of progress depends on segmentation. To move forward confidently, the past must feel settled. The deep, unrecorded span of human life felt unsettled by comparison. It raised too many questions. So it was left behind. This did not erase prehistoric influence. It only made it harder to see. Once attention shifted forward, continuity became invisible. Ancient decisions continued shaping behavior, landscapes, and instincts, but without acknowledgement. Influence persisted without credit. The silent ancestors became anonymous not because they disappeared, but because the story no longer needed them. Modern identity could be constructed without referencing their complexity. Simpler narratives worked better. Linearity replaced layering. This boundary also affected how people felt about time. The past became something receding behind, not something present beneath. Depth was replaced by distance. What lay far back felt remote rather than foundational. Prehistory's dismissal was not an act of forgetting, it was an act of prioritization. Writing taught societies to value what could be accumulated, cited, and controlled. What could not was allowed to fade from concern. Yet beneath this official division, life continued uninterrupted. People carried forward inherited habits, responses, and ways of seeing that had formed long before writing. The past remained active, just unrecognized. Once the past is dismissed in this way, its influence becomes invisible. It still shapes choices, instincts, and expectations, but without name or acknowledgement. The story now prepares to turn inward again, toward how this unrecognized inheritance continues to operate within modern life, shaping what feels natural, inevitable, and unquestioned, even when its origins lie far beyond the line history chose to draw. We inherited more than we ever remember learning. Long after prehistory was dismissed and writing claimed authority, ancient influence continued moving forward unnoticed. It did not announce itself as legacy. It settled into routine. Settlement patterns followed ground, chosen thousands of years earlier. Fields spread where people had once paused repeatedly. Villages rose, where paths converged because they always had. What later societies called planning often followed instinct refined long before intention. Agricultural rhythms carried the same quiet continuity. Planting followed cycles learned through generations of watching land respond. Harvest timing echoed earlier movements that tracked season rather than calendar. Even when tools changed, behavior remained familiar. The past did not instruct, it guided. What worked before felt natural again. Social instincts persisted as well. Humans continued organizing around proximity, familiarity, and shared habit. Trust formed through repetition. Suspicion grew from distance. These tendencies were not invented by later civilizations. They were inherited responses to living together in fixed spaces for long periods. People believed they were choosing structure, but often they were accepting patterns already shaped. Symbolic thinking endured beneath explanation. Ritual gestures survived as custom. Sacred dates persisted as tradition. Stories changed, but their structure remained recognizable. Cycles of loss, return, and renewal continued guiding meaning. Even as myth replaced memory, the emotional logic underneath stayed intact. Later, civilizations believed they were building something new. Cities felt original, laws felt deliberate, beliefs felt refined, yet much of what supported them had been shaped without design. Foundations so deeply embedded felt invisible. What is inherited without memory feels inevitable. This is the quiet power of continuity. Influence that goes unrecognized is rarely questioned. When patterns feel natural, they escape scrutiny. People defend what they assume they chose, unaware it arrived before them. Originality becomes assumption rather than reality. Forgotten inheritance reshaped confidence. Progress appeared linear because its roots were hidden. Innovation seemed autonomous because its dependencies were forgotten. The deeper the foundation, the easier it was to overlook. The ground held everything steady, while attention moved elsewhere. This does not diminish later achievement. It reframes it. Building requires material. Much of Europe's material was cultural rather than physical, shaped long before anyone claimed authorship. Civilization rose, using inherited templates that felt self-evident. The weight of this continuity presses quietly against modern identity. Comfort with boundaries, attachment to place, belief in structure, trust in record over instinct all arrived through accumulation. They feel chosen because they feel familiar. Recognizing inheritance does not demand return. It invites awareness. The past continues operating without permission. What matters is noticing where choice ends and habit begins. With inheritance revealed, attention turns to loss. What faded when writing narrowed memory? What remains accessible beneath layers of explanation? The final movements of this story will not search for recovery, but for recognition, listening again for what survived without asking to be remembered. Some voices were never meant to speak, only to shape. As the story slows, silence begins to feel less like an absence and more like a presence that has always been there. Beneath the layers of writing, myth, and memory, something older continues to move quietly. The silent ancestors were not erased. They simply stopped being quoted. Their influence lives where explanation fails. It lives in instinctive responses to landscape, in the comfort found in repetition, in the unease that arises when familiar patterns are broken. It lives in ritual remnants that survive long after belief has changed, in gestures repeated without knowing their origin, in shared fears that feel ancient because they are. History did not replace silence. It layered over it. Writing, story, and structure formed a surface that feels solid, but beneath that surface, older ways of knowing still operate. Silence was not defeated, it was covered. What could not be named did not disappear. It learned how to exist without permission. Listening to this silence requires a different kind of attention. It does not announce itself through facts or timelines. It appears in moments when people feel connected to place, without knowing why. When certain spaces feel heavy or calm without explanation. When loss feels ritualized, even without belief. These responses are not random, they are inherited. The silent ancestors continue shaping behavior without asking to be recognized. They influence how people gather, how they mark transitions, how they respond to uncertainty. These patterns persist not because they were preserved deliberately, but because they were useful long before explanation was needed. Silence holds what was never written down because it never had to be. Knowledge that lived in bodies, in movement, in shared rhythm, did not require recording to survive. It required repetition. That repetition continues in subtle forms, embedded in daily life, where it feels natural rather than historical. This reframing changes how loss is understood. What vanished was not influence, but visibility. What faded was not wisdom, but acknowledgement. The past did not collapse into nothing. It slipped out of focus. Silence becomes meaningful again when it is no longer treated as emptiness. When history is seen as one layer rather than the whole structure, depth returns. The ground beneath modern life feels thicker, more inhabited. The present stops floating alone. This perspective invites listening without urgency. The story does not demand recovery or restoration. It asks for recognition. To notice that what feels instinctive often carries long memory. To accept that not everything meaningful can be articulated. Silence teaches patience. It resists final explanation. It does not resolve into answers. It offers continuity instead. By acknowledging silence as presence, the narrative prepares to confront what happens when connection to that depth weakens. As modern life accelerates, attention lifts away from what cannot be quantified or recorded. Instinct dulls. Ritual thins. Familiarity with place erodes. Silence grows harder to hear not because it fades, but because listening changes. This prepares the final movement of the story. With silence recognized again, the cost of disconnection becomes clearer. What is lost when roots are ignored is not tradition alone, but orientation. The closing chapters will not argue for return. They will trace what happens when the quiet foundations are no longer felt, and how meaning shifts when depth is replaced by surface alone. Silence still speaks. It always has. It shapes without instruction. It waits beneath explanation. The question that remains is not whether it exists, but whether modern life still knows how to hear it. Progress only works if the past stays silent. Once history was given a starting line, everything that followed appeared to move upward. A line creates direction. Direction invites comparison. Comparison turns change into improvement almost automatically. What comes later feels better, not because it is deeper, but because it is newer. This is how progress becomes a story rather than a measurement. When writing defined where history began, everything before it was pushed into shadow. What followed could now be arranged as sequence. Sequence suggested motion. Motion suggested advancement. The past became something left behind rather than something carried forward. Distance replaced depth as the main indicator of growth. Modern Europe measures progress by separation. Technologies advance because they differ from what came before. Systems are praised because they break from tradition. Speed becomes evidence of success. The faster change occurs, the more convincing the story feels. Complexity increases, but continuity weakens. Life becomes denser, but thinner. This narrative does not require contempt for the past. It requires indifference toward it. To move forward confidently, societies must feel that earlier ways were incomplete. Remembering too much complicates direction. Deep memory slows momentum. Forgetting smooths the path. The silent ancestors became casualties of this logic, not because they failed, but because they disrupt the story. Their lives do not fit neatly into a narrative of ascent. They complicate the idea that humanity steadily improves rather than adapts. They remind us that much of what we value now was once achieved without what we call progress. This forgetting was not malicious. It was functional. Progress depends on confidence. Confidence depends on believing the present is more refined than the past. When depth is acknowledged, certainty weakens. When continuity is recognized, novelty loses its authority. This does not make progress false. It makes it selective. Progress highlights what changes and ignores what endures. It celebrates innovation and overlooks inheritance. It values efficiency and neglects wisdom that cannot be optimized. Speed replaces continuity here. Life accelerates because acceleration proves momentum. Slowness feels regressive. Reflection feels indulgent. Depth feels unnecessary when outcomes can be produced faster. Yet speed leaves little space for listening. What cannot keep pace is left behind. The story of progress creates hierarchy across time. Earlier becomes simpler, later becomes superior. This hierarchy reassures the present of its position. It explains dominance. It justifies replacement. What came before can be honored abstractly, but not consulted deeply. Complexity replaces depth. Systems grow larger, but connection thins. Knowledge expands, but meaning fragments. The story insists this is improvement. It must. Without that belief, progress stalls. The blind spot appears quietly. Progress struggles to see what it costs. It rarely accounts for what fades when attention shifts forward. What is lost is not just tradition, but orientation. Not just memory, but a sense of placement within time. The silent ancestors matter here because they reveal another way of existing. Their lives show that continuity can coexist with change. That depth can persist without stagnation. That meaning does not require constant replacement. Remembering them threatens the story. If earlier life contained richness, adaptation, and intelligence, then modern certainty feels less secure. Progress prefers clean contrast. Before and after. Primitive and advanced. Silence and speech. This is why progress requires forgetting. Not total erasure, but selective absence. The past must remain background, not foundation. It can be acknowledged briefly, but not felt fully. Feeling it would interrupt motion. The narration does not condemn progress. It simply notices how it works. It observes that progress is a perspective, not a law. A story that organizes time in one direction while ignoring others. Once progress is understood as narrative, its trade becomes visible. Something was gained. Something was exchanged. The story now turns to what modern life surrendered in return for speed, confidence, and forward motion, and why what was lost still lingers quietly beneath everything that claims to be new. We gained control and lost attunement. Long before progress accelerated time, life unfolded inside cycles that could not be rushed. Seasons arrived when they arrived. Growth followed decay. Movement responded to weather, light, and need. Early Europeans lived inside this rhythm, not as observers, but as participants. Uncertainty was not an interruption. It was the condition of living. Modern life changed that relationship. Cycles were replaced with schedules. The body learned to obey clocks instead of light. Seasons became background rather than instruction. Growth was expected on demand, and decay was hidden from view. Permanence replaced return. Abstraction replaced presence. Something subtle shifted in the process. Intimacy with uncertainty faded. Where unpredictability once demanded attention and listening, it now triggers discomfort. Silence, once filled with meaning, feels empty. Darkness, once reflective, feels intrusive. Stillness, once instructive, feels unproductive. This change did not come from weakness. It came from success. Control reduced danger. Predictability increased efficiency. Systems protected against famine, exposure, and isolation. Yet, emotional orientation shifted alongside physical security. When life stopped asking for adaptation daily, attunement dulled. Early Europeans did not romanticize uncertainty. They respected it. They lived close enough to unpredictability that it shaped perception. Modern Europe created distance. Risk was managed indirectly. Land was mediated. Memory was externalized. Over time, the senses that once tracked subtle change lost relevance. Modern anxiety may rise from this separation. Not from immediate threat, but from disconnection. The body still carries rhythms shaped by cycles, but the environment rarely responds to them. The mind operates in abstraction, while instinct waits for cues that never arrive. People feel restless without knowing why. There is safety, yet unease. Comfort, yet tension. The ground beneath life feels stable, but also distant. Silence becomes uncomfortable because it no longer carries instruction. Stillness feels empty because meaning has moved elsewhere. This is not loss in the dramatic sense. It is misalignment. Systems evolved faster than perception. Control expanded without updating emotional vocabulary. The world became reliable, but less communicative. Attunement faded because it was no longer required for survival. The cost is subtle but persistent. Reflection feels difficult. Waiting feels intolerable. Uncertainty feels like failure rather than condition. Many of the skills that once oriented life feel obsolete, even though the body has not forgotten them. Darkness once marked transition. Now it signals interruption. Silence once invited listening. Now it demands filling. Cycles once taught patience. Now patience feels inefficient. These changes do not require blame. They reveal trade. The narration does not suggest return. The past cannot be recreated, nor should it be. It offers awareness instead. To recognize that something vital was traded unknowingly. Not safety for danger, but attunement for control. Early life trained humans to sense change before it arrived. Modern systems announce change after it happens. This alters emotional posture. Alertness becomes anxiety. Adaptation becomes reaction. Yet something remains. Even in abstraction, people seek rhythm. They return to ritual without naming it. They crave repetition, grounding, seasonal markers. They invent structure to replace what was once felt naturally. Loss does not erase memory, it buries it. The body remembers how to respond to cycles, even when the environment no longer honors them. This creates tension rather than clarity. Recognizing this tension does not solve it, it reframes it. Unease becomes signal rather than flaw. Anxiety becomes information rather than weakness. It points to separation rather than danger. With loss identified, the question shifts. What survived the trade? What still operates quietly beneath modern abstraction? What can be acknowledged without undoing everything that came after? The next movement turns toward persistence rather than absence. Toward what ancient attunement still lives within instinct, habit, and shared response. Not to restore the past, but to notice what never fully left. The oldest parts of us never needed permission to survive. Long after stories narrowed, rituals formalized, and progress accelerated forward, something older remained quietly intact. The silent ancestors did not vanish. They settled deeper, moving beneath language, beneath explanation, beneath conscious awareness. What could not be carried openly adapted by hiding in habit, instinct, and response. Inheritance does not require recognition to function. The body remembers without asking the mind to agree. People still gather instinctively in circles. They still mark transitions with shared action, rather than private thought. Birth, loss, change, and renewal are still surrounded by repetition, symbol, and pause. Even when belief shifts, behavior often remains. Ritual fragments persist in unexpected places. A moment of silence feels necessary, even when its meaning is unclear. Repetition brings comfort, even when its origin is forgotten. Certain gestures feel respectful without requiring explanation. These actions are not learned from doctrine alone. They rise from something older than instruction. Communal behavior still follows ancient logic. Trust forms through proximity and familiarity. Distance breeds uncertainty. Shared experience creates belonging faster than shared opinion. These responses were shaped long before systems attempted to manage them. They continue operating quietly, even when modern structures discourage acknowledging them. Place still speaks, even when language does not explain why. Some landscapes feel calming, others feel heavy. People sense attachment to certain environments without clear reason. This is not nostalgia. It is memory that never learned to speak. The land still communicates through resonance rather than narrative. Symbolic response endures as well. Certain shapes, sounds, and rhythms feel meaningful without explanation. Fire still draws attention. Darkness still shifts perception. Cycles still feel grounding, even when they are no longer necessary for survival. Meaning did not disappear. It changed location. What we are missing has not been erased. It has become unconscious. Modern life often bypasses these ancient responses, but it cannot eliminate them. They surface in art, habit, and longing. They reveal themselves in moments of pause, in discomfort that has no immediate cause, in comfort that cannot be justified. This persistence reframes loss. The past was not destroyed, it was integrated. Its influence did not depend on preservation, it depended on usefulness. The traits that mattered most did not require explanation to survive. They moved forward, embedded in behavior. This quiet continuity offers relief. It suggests that disconnection is not total. What feels distant is not gone. It is simply operating outside awareness. The task is not recovery, but recognition, to notice what still functions without asking permission. Ancient attunement remains present in the way people seek rhythm. They count time through repetition even in abstract systems. They return to familiar patterns during stress. They recreate cycles artificially because the body still responds to them naturally. The silent ancestors shaped not just survival, but orientation. They taught how to wait, how to gather, how to endure uncertainty. Even when modern systems reduce the need for these skills, the body holds on to them. They do not expire simply because they are no longer required daily. This continuity does not deny change. It coexists with it. Humanity did not move forward by abandoning the past entirely. It carried what worked and buried the rest. What remains is layered, not linear. The comfort in this realization is subtle. It does not promise return or restoration. It offers grounding. Meaning does not have to be reinvented. It already exists beneath awareness, shaping response quietly. Chapter 9 closes not with resolution but with steadiness. The story does not collapse into despair over what was lost. It settles into recognition of what endured. Silence still guides behavior. Instinct still carries memory. The ancient persists, not as record, but as response. With this understanding, the story no longer needs to search. It is ready to release. The final chapter will not explain further. It will widen perspective, allowing the past to rest without demand, and the present to be seen not as detached, but as suspended gently over deep, unseen continuity. History is the surface. Silence is the depth. When viewed from far enough away, the struggle between prehistory and history dissolves. One does not replace the other. One does not erase the other. History floats above prehistory like a thin layer of ice over deep water, supported by what it can no longer see. Modern Europe is not separate from its silent past. It rests on it. Every system, belief, border, and identity sits atop foundations laid without design or awareness. The most influential human choices were made before anyone tried to explain them, before record, before justification, before intention itself became visible. History feels large because it is named. It is broken into eras, dynasties, movements, and causes. It feels heavy because it accumulates detail. Yet when scale shifts, history reveals itself as young, brief, a narrow band of time illuminated by writing, surrounded by vast darkness that was never empty. What shaped humanity most did not announce itself. It did not argue or persuade. It worked quietly through repetition, adaptation, and survival. Long before explanation arrived, patterns were already in place. Writing did not create meaning. It stepped onto a landscape already shaped by it. Seen this way, history becomes a surface phenomenon. It records outcomes, not origins. It documents changes that were already prepared by deeper forces. What appears revolutionary often rests on ancient adjustment. What feels unprecedented usually echoes something older. Silence carried humanity forward because it did not require agreement. It operated beneath awareness, shaping behavior before thought intervened. History, by contrast, requires attention. It demands belief, defense, and explanation. Its influence depends on recognition. This does not diminish history's importance. It reframes its position. History is not the whole story. It is the visible layer of a much thicker structure. Beneath it lies time lived without narration, knowledge preserved without language, memory held without record. When urgency dissolves, perspective widens. The pressure to define, to judge, to explain eases. Instead of digging deeper into names and dates, attention moves outward. The question shifts from what happened to how humanity learned to exist at all. Civilizations rise and fall quickly, compared to the span that shaped human behavior. Empires feel permanent only when scale is small. When scale expands, permanence fades. Patterns matter more than events. Continuity outweighs collapse. Modern identity feels solid because it is recent enough to be named, but beneath it lies adaptability shaped through silence. What feels fixed is often temporary. What feels fragile is often foundational. History's youth explains its confidence. Youth believes it stands alone. Age understands layering. Silence has no need to declare itself because it never left. It supports, without asking for recognition. This perspective softens conflict between past and present. Nothing needs to be recovered or corrected. Nothing was lost completely. The present is not disconnected from its origin. It is suspended over it. Zooming out reveals continuity rather than rupture. The story is not one of replacement, but accumulation. History added a layer. It did not drain the depth beneath it. Judgment loosens here. The need to decide which era mattered most fades. Importance becomes distributed rather than concentrated. Influence spreads across time rather than clustering in moments. The silent ancestors do not demand acknowledgement. Their work is already done. It lives in response, orientation, and instinct. History floats because something deeper holds it. Understanding this does not close questions. It quiets them. The desire to assign blame or credit weakens. Acceptance replaces urgency. From this view, humanity is not racing forward away from its past. It is balancing above it. Every step relies on depth unseen. Once scale is understood, the story no longer needs resolution. It moves naturally toward release, where explanation gives way to perspective, and silence regains its role not as absence, but as support for everything that followed. Some foundations hold because no one tried to own them. As the story begins to loosen its grip, the urge to name, define, and conclude starts to fade. Not everything that matters needs to be captured by language. Not every influence asks to be recorded. Some things endure best when they are left open, unnamed, and unclaimed. The silent ancestors shaped Europe without ever seeking recognition. They did not imagine future generations looking back. They did not act to create legacy. They responded fully to the moments they lived inside, guided by necessity, attention, and adaptation. Their lives were complete without acknowledgement. Anonymity was not erasure. It was freedom. Naming is often mistaken for respect. To define feels like honoring, but it can also limit. Categories compress complexity. Labels freeze movement. Once something is named, it becomes easier to control, easier to rank, easier to forget in its full form. Silence resists this. It keeps meaning flexible. The desire to identify the first people, the original culture, the foundational belief, comes from modern habits of thought. These habits search for certainty and closure. Yet the deepest influences rarely offer either. They operate without signature. They shape without explanation. Letting the ancestors remain unnamed is not an act of neglect. It is an acknowledgement of how they lived. Their influence came from participation, not proclamation. They mattered because they responded well, not because they were remembered. This perspective shifts how meaning is understood. Meaning does not always need recognition to function. Influence does not require remembrance to persist. Many of the most stable structures in human behavior arrived without authorship. They endure because no one tried to claim them. Silence protects complexity. When something is unnamed, it can be approached from many angles. It can remain responsive. Naming fixes position. Silence allows movement. The ancestors belonged to a time before fixation became necessity. Their legacy survives because it was never formalized. Modern life often seeks closure. Stories end with conclusions. Explanations demand resolution. Yet history does not always move toward clarity. Sometimes it moves toward quiet acceptance. Not everything unresolved is incomplete. By resisting revelation here, the story offers rest. There is no hidden name to uncover, no final truth withheld. The depth explored throughout this journey does not require exposure to remain meaningful. It continues operating regardless. Letting go of the need to define also softens responsibility. The ancestors do not ask to be honored. They do not require preservation. Their work persists through instinct, habit, and response. They shaped Europe by living fully, not by building monuments. This release allows humility to settle in. Modern identity loosens its grip on ownership of meaning. The past does not exist to validate the present. It exists as foundation, not credential. Some influences remain strongest when they are not spoken. They resist being turned into symbols or narratives. They continue shaping behavior quietly, without demanding attention. In allowing the ancestors to remain unnamed, The story avoids claiming what cannot be owned. It respects the form in which influence originally arrived, not as declaration, but as response. This does not end the story with answers. It ends it with permission. Permission to accept uncertainty without anxiety. Permission to value what cannot be neatly explained. With this acceptance, the narrative prepares to rest. There is no need to resolve what remains silent. The final movement will not conclude in certainty, but in stillness. The story does not close a door. It gently steps aside, allowing what has always been there to remain, unmeasured, unnamed, and intact. Nothing ended. Everything only changed form. As the story slows, it releases its grip on explanation and allows stillness to return. Civilization is no longer framed as achievement stacked upon achievement, but as rhythm: rise, settle, fade, and return again in altered shape. What appears solid loosens when viewed across time, and what seemed fragile reveals quiet endurance. From this distance, urgency dissolves. The pressure to define, measure, and conclude weakens. Human societies move like breath, expanding outward, drawing back inward, never fully stopping. Empires feel vast only when time is narrow. When time widens, they become brief expressions of a deeper continuity that never announced itself. Nothing is lost here. Forms dissolve, but influence travels on. Practices thin, but patterns persist. The silent ancestors do not vanish into mystery. They settle back into the flow that carried them forward. Their presence becomes indistinguishable from motion itself. What once felt distant now feels foundational. Memory loosens its hold. The need to remember precisely gives way to acceptance that not everything asks to be recalled. Awareness continues without record. Meaning survives without declaration. Silence resumes its original role, not as emptiness, but as rest. Viewed gently, humanity becomes one current among many, significant but not central. The land continues shaping response. Cycles repeat with or without witnesses. Change arrives without announcement. Continuity does not require attention to function. Beyond Europe, the pattern remains. Beyond humanity, it widens further. Life arranges itself through emergence and release. Awareness observes briefly, then transforms. Forms appear, adapt, dissolve. Nothing argues with this process. Nothing needs to be preserved in its current shape. The past does not ask to be rescued from impermanence. It already completed its work. Influence passed forward quietly, embedded in response rather than record. What mattered made its way through without demanding permanence. From here, explanation feels unnecessary. The story does not need to resolve into meaning. It can soften into quiet recognition. Existence continues without needing to be understood fully. The silence that shaped everything remains present, steady, untroubled. The long sleep of history is not forgetting. It is rest. It is motion settling into stillness before rising again elsewhere. Awareness drifts without urgency, without demand. Nothing ended. Everything only changed form. The story releases itself here, not into absence, but into continuity that holds without effort, carrying what was, what is, and what will be, without needing to speak. It widens further still, beyond stories and species, into the simple fact of awareness, noticing change. The earth turns. Seasons repeat. Forms emerge, pass through experience, and return to material without drama. Meaning is not lost in this movement, it is redistributed. Civilizations inhale and exhale. Each breath gathers structure, memory, and explanation, then releases them back into silence. Nothing is forced to remain. Nothing essential is wasted. What feels like an ending from within becomes rest when seen from afar. From this distance, urgency dissolves completely. There is no task left undone, no truth waiting to be recovered. The world continues regardless of witnesses. Awareness expresses itself, releases form, and continues. Humanity becomes one rhythm among many, significant but not final. The long arc of existence does not pause for understanding. It moves on gently, carrying everything forward in altered shape. The story does not close with resolution. It loosens and drifts. Listening replaces seeking. Stillness replaces conclusion. In this release, there is no loss, only continuity, only rest. Awareness settles without needing to hold itself. Nothing asks to be completed. The stream of time carries experience onward, gently reshaping what passes through it. What once felt urgent dissolves into rhythm. The mind relaxes its grip. The body rests. Silence remains, not as void, but as field, a place where forms arise and fall away without resistance. In this quiet, there is no demand to remember and no pressure to forget. There is simply continuation. The story ends where it began, inside movement without narration. The long sleep is not an ending, but a pause within an ongoing process that never truly stops. Everything breathes, releases, and becomes something else. It carries on without witness or memory, calm and sufficient. Nothing needs to conclude for existence to continue unfolding. Rest settles naturally. This is where the listener is invited to drift, allowing the story to fade into quiet awareness, where depth holds without explanation and continuity carries everything forward gently, endlessly, without needing to be named or understood. There is nothing left to seek, nothing left to resolve, only the long, patient motion of being itself. It rests, and so do we. Now, quietly, without expectation, time continues. Gently on,